our perennial beds just keep getting better and better with age, and initially we may have started out with just 1 or 2 plants on a trial basis, and now some of our favorite ones are starting to surface. So we're going to take a few cuttings to try to expand those areas. Now, initially we may have had 1 plant maybe because they were too expensive, or it may have been the only one that the nursery was carrying, or again we maybe weren't even sure how well it would perform, and so now we've got some areas where only 1 plant is coming along. For example, right here with the lamiastrum, which is the yellow archangel, we only have 1 plant, and it's really done pretty nicely for us with the yellow flowers that it had earlier this summer. So we're going to come in and take some cuttings, and these are going to be asexual cuttings, which means that it's going to be identical to the plant, the parent plant, because we're going to take cuttings right off of that plant. And that way we can plant some more in the area and fill in some larger spaces. Now the things that we're going to need are some moist paper towels and a plastic bag, and that way you can keep the cuttings moist until you get ready to stick them. And usually on the cuttings, we're talking about herbaceous type plants. You want them 4 to 6 inches long, and we're just going to go in and snip some of those out in various places. And again, there's a lot of good growth on here, and it's very succulent growth. And this time of year in the fall, it's a good idea to do it before some of the plants get killed back for the winter. Once you take the cuttings, we're not going to do anything else to them yet. We're just going to wrap them in the moist paper towel to keep them moist where they don't dehydrate. Now another good practice is to do this early in the morning when there's a lot of moisture in the plants, and if you wait till later in the day or on a hot sunny day, they're going to be wilted a little bit and maybe not perform for you. Also, one of the favorite plants right here beside me is one of our hardy hibiscus plants, and it's also a perennial. It's a herbaceous plant. It gets a little bit more woodier, so we're going to take tip cuttings, and we're just going to cut right on the very tip there, 4 to 6 inches. And we'll snip off a few of those and get them ready. And again, if you're going to take cuttings like this, say from a neighbor or somebody, and you're not going to be able to get the plants ready, you can also put your bag with your moist paper towel in the refrigerator for overnight and keep them that way until you're ready to do it. But it's pretty windy out here today, so we're going to go in the hobby greenhouse and we'll show you how to get these ready for future propagation. Well, to get started on tip or stem cuttings from herbaceous plants, you'll need a few more supplies, and I want to show you, first of all, you'll need some kind of a propagation medium, and most people will just use moist sand, which we have here, and that's what we're going to use in some of our bigger trays. But I also want to remind you about the peat pots. This is one from Easy Soil, but it's not just peat moss, it has the polymers in it, so it holds moisture a little bit more and expands to this size. That's one of the little discs right there. And the polymers, remember, are little granules that almost look like sugar, a little bit bigger. And when you add moisture, they increase hundreds of times their size. And this is one of those packets in this cup with moisture, and you can see it starting to fill out and flow over even. So you could propagate right in these mixes, but it would be pretty costly, so I would encourage you to mix it with other potting soil. And we have some back here that's just peat moss and perlite, and that's our normal potting mix that we use in a lot of our container plants. But really, if you're going to use just this, you would need to add a little bit more perlite so it would drain for you a little bit better, or we could mix in the polymers and hold moisture, because the peat moss really dries out pretty quickly. So you have several options in the rooting media. Next, you want to use a rooting hormone, and we have one here, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, and that's real important. Also, you need some way to get moisture to the soil, a mister bottle or a watering can. And then it'd be nice to have some labels handy, so you could label your cuttings so you don't forget what the parent plants are, and then of course your cuttings. So let's get started. Now remember, we took some cuttings off of some of our red hibiscus, and anytime you take cuttings, if this has been in the refrigerator overnight, you'd probably want to make a fresh cut on the bottom of the stem. Then you want to always go ahead and remove, say, the bottom 2, 3, maybe 4 leaves. And you can cut them off that way, and anything that has a flower bud or a flower on it, you want to remove it, because that actually takes away from the propagation part, because you're putting more energy into the flower and sometimes the cutting won't take. Then you want to dip it into the rooting hormone. Now, used to, I would believe that rooting hormone was an optional type thing, and I've seen a lot more research on it, and I see that it really does increase the success rate. It adds more roots to it. It helps callus over, and if you're doing a whole bunch of plants, it will actually increase the success rate. But notice that this is a rooting hormone, and rooting hormones are really naturally occurring on the plants anyway, but now they're synthetically made, and this one is IBA. It's referred to on the back here. You can buy them at any garden center or supply area. And it's best to put the hormone in a different container, because if there's any disease on your seedlings or your cuttings, you may increase that disease chance by putting it back in the bottle. So put it in a separate container, dip it in, and sometimes people will even put the rooting powder up on the stem cuts too. You may get some roots there, but then tap off the excess because you don't want a lot on there. And then you would just stick it into the sand, and we're just using some moist sand here, and we're going to tap it down a little bit so it'll hold real nicely. And it's just in some of our old trays or flats that we've used, one that has a lot more support on it, and then we put it in another one to make sure, because sand is very heavy. And again, we would just do that with several different ones. And again, sometimes when you're doing it in a hurry, you can just snap them off like this, look for any flower buds, tap it in there, and then stick those cuttings again. Now we're going to label them as a red hibiscus, and we've got several more that we could follow through with. But once you get them stuck, moisture is very important. You don't want to let this dry out. And it can take anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 weeks for the roots to actually form before you ever bump it up in another container. But during that process, the very first thing that occurs is what we call callusing. And this is a Cenogeranium that Alan took a cutting on about 6 weeks ago. And it's a little bit harder to see, but you'll see some callusing, or it almost looks like warty growth on the cutting. And from that callusing, which the rooting hormone helped initiate, that's where your roots will form. And so this cutting, it took it quite a while to get started, but it's starting to root, and again, it's in pretty good shape. Now we can stick that back in there and continue to use it, but one thing you want to be careful about when you're doing cuttings is once they're ready to root, and if you're doing this in the home, you want to make sure you've got a nice warm area. You may want to set this on the refrigerator, put it in direct light with lots of moisture. But make sure that once the plants are rooted, you got to bump them up into other containers. And here's some mums too that are about 6 weeks old, and look at the difference on these. One of them is a lot paler, it's stretching, that's telling us maybe it's a little deficient in nutrients, also low light levels, and it really hasn't been pinched appropriately, so it's real leggy. And this one is a nice sturdy transplant, and these could be kept indoors in direct light once they get to this stage, and then you just keep them until you put them out next springtime. Of course, for us, we're a lot more fortunate because we have the hobby greenhouse, and we would continue to keep them nice and compact, fertilized. And then next year when we put them outside, you want to harden them off. If you just stick them straight outside like you do anything, you can get wind damage and sunburn. So hardening the plants off is real important. Now another thing with the moisture that you can do, in the greenhouse, if there's lots of humidity, you don't have to worry about this. But you could put this tray and just slide a trash bag over it, and once you would water it in with the moisture. And what you want to do is make sure that you water it nicely on the foliage, and then soak the soil down real well, and then we just slide that in there, tie it off, and again keep an eye on it so it doesn't get too wet or you'd get some disease problems. Now again, that's probably the easiest thing with cuttings. One thing I want to caution you about though is if you get a plant, read the label. There's a lot of new plants that are coming out, like this particular petunia. It's called a Supertunia. Particular one is Sunlover series, and if you'll look right here, it says propagation prohibited. Now this is especially crucial for garden centers, people who are growing and selling, because they don't want you to propagate these, and the people who invented them are losing money that way. And it would really hold true to a home situation too. So read the label. Of course, if they find out about it, they can prosecute you, but check and make sure that there's not any kind of guidelines on some of the plants that you're growing. Now again, that's tip or stem cuttings. The next one I want to show you real quickly, we use everything the same, only we're going to use a little bit different cutting. Now with stem and tip cuttings, we're talking about herbaceous leafy type plants that have alternate leaves, and it's really hard to know. Sometimes you just have to go to the literature or ask around and get good references. But you also have plants that are what we call whorled leaves, and here's an example of one, which is echinacea. And you can see that it has a whorl, a group of leaves, and we've washed some of them off for you. It had one major stem that bloomed for us this year, but if we were to take a cutting off of this flower stem, it really wouldn't root for us. So in this particular one, and there are other examples too, things like geraniums, the perennial geraniums, some phlox, statice, stokesea, things that again grow in more of a whorl, you can actually take root cuttings. And you can divide some of these too at certain times of the year, but we're going to use moist sand. And what I'm going to do is just take about a 2 to 2.5 inch root, and you want to remember which was top, and the top side, and there's actually dormant buds along here that would break and a plant would grow. Now this takes a little bit longer. You can put them horizontal. I'm going to lay them at a 45-degree angle, just cover them a little bit with the sand, and you have to watch and monitor them, but those are root cuttings, and that's kind of a little bit more challenging even than the stem cuttings. And we've kind of used this as our own built-in greenhouse, which you could also use for the stem cuttings. So there's lots of options. It's a lot of fun to try. The hard part really this time of year is once you get them going is trying to keep them alive inside until you plant them next spring. A lot of things like some of our Artemisia, some of our Oenothera, things that are just spreading drastically, you can wait and divide those next year and you don't even have to worry about this process. But a few pointers for you. Don't worry about your success rate being 100% because it doesn't even work that way in the commercial industry. You're going to lose a few to root rot problems. Some just won't start. Some will be smaller than others. But again, you may get 3 or 4 or 5, and that's enough to increase a flowering bed. So try your hand at some of the tip or root cutting propagation.